This is the Forgotten Liturgy. Today, we step back to 1859, a time when the American South was a land of sharp contrasts, extreme wealth, built on the backs of extreme suffering. We are looking into the life of Thomas Wiggins, a young black boy who lived a life of profound contradiction. He was a boy who could sit at a piano and evoke the brilliance of Mozart, yet he never spoke a single word to the world around him. To some, he was a miracle. To others, he was a commodity. This is a difficult and intense journey into a truth many wanted to bury. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe and let us know in the comments which city and country are you listening from. Your presence ensures these stories are never truly forgotten. The setting is the humid summer of 1858 in Columbus, Georgia. The air inside the concert hall was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, and the low hum of 800 people. In the front rows sat the elite plantation owners and their wives, draped in silk, their status cemented by a system that owned the very performers they came to see. These people had paid their hard-earned currency to witness what the broadsheets described as the greatest musical curiosity of the age. But the spectacle about to unfold would go far beyond simple entertainment. A grand piano polished to a mirror shine sat isolated under the flickering gaslight. James Neil Bethune, a lawyer and former newspaper editor who had amassed a fortune through land and the enslavement of others, stepped onto the stage. He moved with the confidence of a ringmaster. Bethune spoke to the crowd with a chilling charisma, telling them that what they were about to see would challenge their beliefs about the Negro race and the very nature of creation itself. He described the boy as mentally deficient, a child who couldn't read, write, or even dress himself, yet possessed a musical genius that European masters could not match. He gestured to the shadows and introduced him as Blind Tom. A small 8-year-old figure emerged. His skin was dark, almost blue-black under the gas lamps, and his eyes were clouded by thick, milky cataracts. He didn't walk like the sophisticated performers of the era. He moved with an odd, shuffling gait, his head bobbing and his hands flapping in rhythmic patterns, behaviors we would now recognize as signs of autism. The audience's reaction was immediate and visceral. There were gasps of pity and even murmurs of disgust. Some felt they had been cheated, seeing a broken child rather than a star. But the moment Tom's fingers touched the keys, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Tom began with Beethoven Esse Sonata Pathetique. It is a piece of immense technical and emotional complexity, a work that professional pianists spend a lifetime perfecting. Yet, this 8-year-old boy, who had been blind since birth and lived in a world of near-total silence, played it flawlessly. Every note resonated with the exact precision Beethoven intended. The music surged like ocean waves from a whisper to a thunderous storm. When he finished, there was no applause, only a heavy, stunned silence. The audience was incapable of processing the cognitive dissonance. How could a child deemed less than human by their society possess such a divine gift? Bethune, seeing their shock, pushed the spectacle further. He invited anyone to test the boy. A skeptical music teacher from Macon, trained in the classical traditions of Philadelphia, stepped up to a second piano. He played a complex Chopin etude, filled with intricate scales and rapid fingerwork. Convinced that Tom's performance was a rehearsed trick, Tom sat motionless, his head tilted as if listening to a frequency no one else could hear. When the teacher finished, Tom sat down and played the etude back, note for note. In the 17th measure, the audience finally erupted. Over the next hour, the curiosity became a legend. He reproduced a hymn composed by a local organist that had never been heard by another soul. He played a complex melody with his right hand, a different one with his left, and then added a third original melody using the piano pedals all simultaneously. He even mimicked the German accent of an immigrant who sang a folk song. By the end of the night, grown men were in tears and women had fainted as the music teacher sat in despair, feeling his life's work had been eclipsed. James Bethune stood in the wings, mentally calculating the immense profit this curiosity would bring him. This night in Columbus was only the beginning of a long, dark road of fame and exploitation. Historical fact: in the 1850s, while Thomas Wiggins was beginning his career, there were approximately 3.9 million enslaved black people in the United States. Under the laws of the time, they were considered property, not persons. and had zero legal claim to the wages they earned or the intellectual property they created. Over the next 5 decades, the blind boy from Georgia would transform into the most famous musician in America. He would play for presidents, fill the grandest concert halls across Europe, and receive standing ovations from the world's most elite critics. His talent would generate a fortune equivalent to over $20 million in today's currency. Yet, Thomas Wiggins would never see a single cent of that wealth. He would never choose his own meals, decide where he lived, or experience the warmth of a chosen family. Even when the law eventually declared him a free man, Thomas remained, in every psychological and physical sense, a slave until the day he died. This is the tragic paradox of Blind Tom, the greatest musical genius America ever produced, and the story of how the nation systematically dismantled his humanity for profit. The tragedy began on May 25, 1849, on a plantation in Harris County, Georgia. His mother, Charity, was the property of a man named Way Jones. Tom was her 13th child, born into a world that already viewed him as a liability. He arrived with his eyes clouded by thick, milky cataracts, rendering him stone blind. But the darkness was more than physical. Charity noticed that unlike her other children, Tom was eerily unresponsive. He didn't react to his name, he didn't cry for comfort, and he seemed to exist in a permanent state of internal isolation. The other enslaved people whispered that the child was cursed or soulless, a divine punishment for some unknown sin. In reality, Tom was experiencing a world built entirely of vibrations and echoes, a mind wired differently than any the people of Georgia had ever encountered. In the autumn of 1850, when Tom was just 18 months old, Way Jones decided to liquidate his merchandise to pay off mounting debts. On the auction block in Columbus, Charity stood clutching her silent, blind child. Among the buyers was James Neal Bethune, a calculating lawyer and newspaperman looking for strong field hands. Bethune saw Charity as a viable worker, but he saw Tom as damaged goods, a useless mouth to feed. To finalize the sale, Jones offered the mother and child as a package deal for a mere $400. Bethune, recognizing a bargain, made the purchase. He didn't know then that this small, defective boy would become his most lucrative investment. The early years at Bethune's plantation, Solitude, were a sensory odyssey for Tom. While his mother labored in the fields, Tom was left in the slave quarters. He remained mute and indifferent to other children, but he developed an obsessive relationship with sound. He would press his ear against the damp Georgia red clay to hear the rhythmic thud of distant footsteps. He would tap on walls for hours, listening to the variations in echo. During the violent summer thunderstorms of the South, he would stand outside with his face turned toward the lightning-streaked sky, absorbing the crash of thunder as if it were a symphony. To the Bethune family and the overseers, he was simply an idiot with strange habits, a broken creature with no future. Everything changed on a humid night in 1855. The Bethune family was gathered in their parlor, where the daughters were struggling through their piano lessons on a magnificent Steinway grand. Hidden in the shadows outside the window, 6-year-old Tom was entranced. He had never heard a piano, and the complexity of the notes seemed to unlock something dormant in his mind. When the house finally fell silent and the family retired to bed, Tom navigated the unfamiliar rooms by the echoes of his own soft footsteps. He found the piano. He sat on the bench, and he began to play. The music shattered the night's silence, waking the entire household. James Bethune burst into the room with a pistol, expecting a burglar, only to find the simple-minded slave child performing his daughter's lesson with supernatural grace and perfect precision. Bethune stood frozen, the pistol hanging uselessly at his side. He watched as the blind, mute boyish fingers danced across the keys with a fluidity that defied every law of the society he lived in. Over the following weeks, Bethune turned his home into a laboratory, conducting experiments on the boy. He brought in local musicians to play increasingly complex pieces, only to watch in disbelief as Tom reproduced them after a single hearing. He discovered Tom could play with his back turned or with his hands crossed, the music flowing through him from some inexplicable source. But Tom wasn't just a mimic. He was a creator. He began improvising dark, complex melodies that bubbled up from his subconscious like water from a hidden spring. Bethune was not a man of music, but he was a man of business, and he realized that the useless child was actually a gold mine waiting to be exploited. By 1857, when Tom was just 8 years old, James Bethune realized that his plantation was no longer his primary source of wealth. The real fortune lay in the small, shuffling boy who sat in the shadows of the parlor. Bethune organized the first public exhibition in Columbus, but he didn't market Tom as a musician. He marketed him as a freak of nature. In the mid-19th century, the freak show was a staple of American entertainment, and Bethune tapped into this morbid curiosity. He plastered the town with posters that described Tom as a biological anomaly, a two-headed calf of the musical world. The hall sold out instantly, with people paying 50 cents, a massive sum at the time, to watch a blind black child perform like a European maestro. By the end of that first night, Bethune had outearned a month's worth of cotton harvests. The tour that followed was a relentless march across the American South. Tom was pulled from the only comfort he knew, his mother's presence, and loaded into a carriage to be paraded through Georgia and South Carolina. The format was a ritual of humiliation, followed by wonder. Bethune would deliver a practiced speech about the idiot savant, a term used to describe someone they believed was mentally defective, yet capable of channeling divine genius. Tom was treated like a vessel, not a creator. While the money poured in, Tom's reality remained unchanged. He slept in damp basements, ate the scraps from Bethune's table, and lived under total ownership, body and soul. Modern science allows us to see Tom through a different lens. He was almost certainly autistic, exhibiting what we now call savant syndrome. This rare condition allows individuals with developmental challenges to display superhuman abilities in specific areas like music or memory. Tom's repetitive rocking, his hand flapping, and his sensitivity to textures were classic signs of a mind wired for intense focus. He likely possessed perfect pitch and an eidetic memory for sound, allowing him to store every note he ever heard in a permanent internal library. In the 1850s, however, the word autism didn't exist. To the white audiences of the South, Tom was simply an idiot. This label was a convenient tool of oppression. If Tom wasn't fully human, then exploiting him wasn't a crime, it was stewardship. Yet, Tom's behavior proved he was far more conscious than they admitted. He responded to kindness, felt distress when treated harshly, and possessed a stubborn artistic will. He couldn't be forced to play if he was upset, and he would often mock music he disliked by exaggerating its flaws. This wasn't the behavior of a mindless machine. It was the defiance of an artist trapped in a system that refused to see him. By 1860, Tom was a superstar, but he was also a threat to the very foundation of slavery. Southern ideology was built on the lie that black people were mentally inferior and incapable of higher thought. Tom's existence blew that lie apart. Here was a piece of property who could outperform any white musician in the country. To protect the status quo, Bethune doubled down on the freak narrative, insisting Tom was just a biological fluke, a vessel rather than a thinking man. Meanwhile, Northern abolitionists used Tom as a symbol of the immense potential being crushed under the weight of chains. As the shadow of the Civil War loomed, Bethune's greed turned into desperation. If the North won, he would lose his most valuable asset. To secure his investment, he created a legal Shama contract with Tom's parents, Charity and Mingo. The document claimed they agreed to let Bethune manage Tom's career for a small fee. In reality, as enslaved people, Charity and Mingo had no legal right to sign contracts, no power to negotiate, and no way to say no. The contract was nothing more than a paper shield for Bethune to hold on to Tom when the world began to change. In April 1861, as the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter, Tom's life was about to be swept up in a war that promised freedom, but, for him, would only bring more layers of confinement. As the Civil War tore the nation apart, Thomas Wiggins was transformed into a powerful propaganda tool for the Confederacy. James Bethune, a staunch supporter of the Southern cause, toured Tom across the seceding states, using the boy's genius to fund the Confederate Army and boost morale. On stage, Bethune would present Tom as living proof of the benevolence of slavery, arguing that such a talent could only flourish under the paternal care of a white master. Confederate generals and politicians cheered, seeing in Tom's music a symbol of their own supposed cultural refinement. But while the audience heard triumph, Tom lived in a silent, locked world. He played what he was told and performed the tricks demanded of him. His true thoughts, buried beneath the weight of his cataracts and his forced silence. Yet, there was a hidden rebellion in Tom's fingers. During the war years, he composed complex pieces, like the Battle of Manhattan. To the Southern ear, these were celebrations of military victory. However, modern musicologists who have analyzed the original compositions found something hauntingly dissonant. Beneath the martial rhythms and triumphal melodies are chords that sound like distant screams. Rhythms that mimic the rhythmic crack of a whip, and minor key shifts that evoke a profound, unutterable sorrow. Many now believe Tom was encoding his true reality into his music as secret, language of resistance that his white audiences were too blinded by their own prejudice to understand. He was hiding his defiance in the very air they breathed, even as they applauded him. In April 1865, the war ended, and the 13th Amendment abolished slavery forever. 4 million people were suddenly free, including Tom's parents, Charity and Mingo. At 16, Tom should have finally owned his life and the hundreds of thousands of dollars he had generated. But Bethune was a man who understood that law could be just as binding as iron within months. He petitioned the court for legal guardianship, arguing that Tom was mentally incompetent and an idiot who required a white man to manage his affairs. Doctors testified to Tom's childlike mind, ignoring the fact that he was the most sophisticated musician in the country. The court agreed, and in the same year slavery died, Thomas Wiggins became a legal ward of James Bethune. The chains had simply been replaced by legal paperwork. This invisible slavery allowed the tours to continue into the North. Tom played for massive crowds in New York and Boston, and in 18, he even performed at the White House for President Andrew Johnson. By the late 1860s, Tom had earned what would be millions today. Yet he owned nothing, not a suit, not a home, not even a dollar. Charity, his mother, watched from a distance as a domestic servant in Georgia. In 1870, she used her meager savings to sue for custody of her son. But Bethune's expensive lawyers argued she was unfit and that removing Tom would destroy his livelihood. The court chose the profit of a white man over the heart of a black mother. Charity died a few years later, never having held her son again outside the gaze of his captors. By the spring of 1882, the prodigy had become a man of 32. A reporter from the New York Times sought him out in a dark boarding house in Virginia, expecting the miracle he had read about. Instead, he found a broken man rocking in a wooden chair, his hair graying at the temples and his clothes worn thin. Tom didn't acknowledge the visitor. He simply rocked and hummed, his fingers tapping an invisible piano against his thighs. He was the most famous musician in America, yet he lived like a ghost in the very society that claimed to have set him free. The reporter began to realize that the real story wasn't the music hit, was the profound, systematic hollow that had been carved out of a human soul in the name of progress. The encounter between the New York Times reporter and Thomas Wiggins in 1882 remains one of the most haunting accounts of Tom's life. When the reporter tried to interview him, Tom offered nothing but the rhythmic rocking of his chair and a low, persistent humming. He existed in a world where words had no currency, but when asked to play, the transformation was celestial. Tom sat at the piano and, for 2 straight hours, navigated the complexities of Bach, Mozart, and his own otherworldly compositions. He played with a handkerchief over the keys and his back turned, yet every note was a strike of genius. The reporter left in tears, writing that Tom was a prisoner of a life. He never chose a man robbed of everything except the music that poured through him. The decade between 1870 and 1880 saw Tom reach the absolute zenith of his fame. He was a global phenomenon, performing for Queen Victoria in England and Emperor Wilhelm I in Germany, while royalty wept at his feet and declared him the most remarkable musician on earth. Tom's reality was a stark contrast of isolation. He traveled from city to city in a relentless circuit, yet he never saw the beauty of the world. He toured. James Bethune maintained an iron grip on his life, depositing every cent of the millions Tom earned into his own accounts. Tom was fed and clothed, but he remained a ghost in the machine of his own success, sleeping in servants' quarters or back rooms, never staying long enough to form a single human connection. This period also marked the beginning of what we would now recognize as severe autistic burnout. Tom suffered from frequent episodes of agitation and confusion, triggered by the overwhelming sensory environment of the stage and the brutal travel schedule. Bethune only paused the shows when Tom was physically too ill to generate revenue. In the rare moments when the professional mask slipped, The tragedy of his loneliness became visible. Stagehands reported hearing him sobbing quietly in the night, and a maid once recalled him desperately holding her hand for minutes. Not out of aggression, but out of a profound, primal need for human contact. He was a star surrounded by thousands, yet he was utterly, devastatingly alone. The cruelty of his situation intensified in 1875 when James Bethune, aging and greedy, transferred Tom's legal guardianship to his son, John. This was not a transition of care, but a transfer of an asset. John was a volatile alcoholic with a violent temper who saw Tom as a personal possession rather than a human being. Under John's management, Tom was frequently berated and mocked for his disabilities. The cycle of exploitation took an even stranger turn in 1882 when John's wife, Eliza, filed for a bitter, public divorce. At the heart of their legal battle was not their marriage, but the custody of blind Tom, the family's primary source of wealth. For years, Tom was a prize to be won in a courtroom where his own voice was never heard. In 1887, the courts finally awarded custody to Eliza. While she was less overtly cruel than John, providing Tom with better food and a slightly slower schedule, her motivations remained rooted in profit. She viewed him as a fading commodity. By the late 1880s and early 90s, the novelty of the musical curiosity began to wear thin. Newer acts were capturing the public's imagination, and Tom, now in his late 30s, was becoming a relic of a past era. He had spent 30 years on the stage, earned a keen-ass ransom for his captors, and yet he remained exactly where he started. A man whose destiny was decided by the signatures of white owners on legal parchment. The final act of Thomas Wiggins' life began not with a roar of applause, but with a slow, agonizing fade into the shadows. By the 1890s, the newspapers that had once catalogued his every move began to treat him as a relic of a bygone era. Eliza Bethune, recognizing that the grand concert halls of New York and London were moving on to newer sensations, shifted her strategy to smaller, secondary markets. The tours became less glamorous, the venues smaller, and the fees lower, yet they remained profitable for his captors. During this time, the once infinite library of Tom's mind began to flicker. He would lose his place in the middle of a Mozart sonata, or forget folk songs he had performed 1,000 times. His improvisations grew jagged and less fluid. More importantly, his silent rebellion intensified. He would sit at the piano in a cold, impenetrable silence, refusing to play no matter how much Eliza pleaded. In a life where he owned nothing, not even his own name, this refusal to perform was perhaps his final, solitary assertion of agency. In 1898, a flicker of hope appeared in the form of Albion Turgi, a white lawyer and former Union soldier who had famously fought the separate but equal doctrine in the Supreme Court. Turgi saw Tom's guardianship for what it truly was, a sophisticated extension of slavery. He filed a lawsuit, arguing that a competent adult should not be held as a ward without his consent, and that the law was being abused to siphon Thomas' earnings. The case became a national sensation, sparking debates about the intersection of race, disability, and the law. However, the American judicial system of 1898 was ill-equipped to recognize the humanity of a man like Tom. Judge after judge ruled that his inability to speak fluently or manage a bank account made him mentally incompetent, necessitating a white guardian. The courts essentially ruled that because Tom could not navigate the world's complexity, he remained the property of the Bethunes, in all but name. The final decade of Tom's life was spent in a small house in Hoboken, New Jersey. Eliza had largely stopped the tours by 1900, as the costs of travel outweighed the dwindling ticket sales. Tom was kept in a back room, cared for by hired servants, and trotted out like a museum exhibit for private performances when Eliza needed a sudden influx of cash. While Eliza told reporters that Tom was a contented child who was happy in his isolation, the reality was much darker. Neighbors reported hearing a mournful, repetitive melody drifting through the walls late at night, sound like a ghost haunting its own life. A doctor who examined him in 1906 noted profound signs of clinical depression and withdrawal, the inevitable result of a lifetime of sensory overload followed by total isolation. On June 13, 1908, Thomas Green Wiggins died of a stroke in that small Hoboken room. He was 59 years old. His death was a mere footnote in the newspapers, which referred to him only as Blind Tom, a nickname that reduced a human life to a disability. Elisa Bethune arranged for a modest funeral and buried him in an unmarked grave in Evergreen Cemetery, Brooklyn. It is a staggering indictment of the era that a man who had earned the equivalent of $20 million, every cent of which went into the pockets of his white guardians, was laid to rest without even a stone to mark his name. For nearly a century, his final resting place was lost to history, forgotten just as the man himself had been erased. It was not until 1976 that researchers finally located the plot, which had been purchased by Elisa under her own name. In 2002, a proper marker was finally placed at his grave. It bears the name Thomas Wiggins Bethune, acknowledging both the artist and the man who claimed to own him. But beneath the names, it finally grants him the title he earned through a lifetime of struggle. Renowned pianist and composer, it took 94 years for the nation to acknowledge that Tom was not a freak or a curiosity, but one of the greatest musical minds to ever grace the American stage. The story of Blind Tom remains an uncomfortable mirror for America, forcing us to ask how much of our cultural wealth was built on the systematic destruction of black genius. He was a man who spoke to the world through the keys of a piano. Yet the world refused to listen to the man behind the music until long after he was gone. The legacy of Thomas Wiggins is a haunting study in the mechanics. It was not until 1976 that researchers finally located the plot, which had been purchased by Elisa under her own name. In 2002, a proper marker was finally placed at his grave. It bears the name Thomas Wiggins Bethune, acknowledging both the artist and the man who claimed to own him. But beneath the names, it finally grants him the title he earned through a lifetime of struggle, renowned pianist and composer. It took 94 years for the nation to acknowledge that Tom was not a freak or a curiosity, but one of the greatest musical minds to ever grace the American stage. The story of Blind Tom remains an uncomfortable mirror for America, forcing us to ask how much of our cultural wealth was built on the systematic destruction of black genius. He was a man who spoke to the world through the keys of a piano. Yet the world refused to listen to the man behind the music until long after he was gone. The legacy of Thomas Wiggins is a haunting study in the mechanics of human exploitation. From James Bethune to his son John, and finally to Eliza, the Bethune family transformed a defective boy into a source of unimaginable wealth. While they grew rich, Tom received only the barest necessities of survival: food, clothing, and a room provided not out of compassion, but as maintenance for a high-functioning machine. Defenders of the Bethunes often argue that they saved Tom from obscurity, providing him a stage he could never have reached alone. Yet, this logic ignores the fundamental theft of consent. Tom never chose his managers, never negotiated his terms, and never agreed to trade his life's work for mere sustenance. True justice would have seen him educated, paid, and respected as a human being with rights. But 19th century America, built on the myth of racial inferiority, was unwilling to see a black man as anything more than a tool for profit. Despite this systematic dehumanization, Thomas Wiggins achieved a victory that his oppressors could never touch. He left behind his music, though many of his 100-plus original compositions have been lost to time. Those that remain reveal a mind of staggering complexity. His most famous work, The Battle of Manassas, was marketed as Confederate propaganda. Yet beneath the surface, it is a visceral depiction of chaos, suffering, and the true horror of war, a message his white audiences cheered for without ever truly understanding. Another work, The Rainstorm, stands as a masterpiece of programmatic genius, using sound to paint a terrifyingly accurate picture of a storm cycle from the first drop of rain to the final crash of thunder. These were not just songs. They were intellectual triumphs over a society that called him an idiot. Perhaps the most profound glimpses of the real Thomas Wiggins were found in his private, unnamed improvisations. Late at night, in the solitude of whatever back room he was confined to, Tom would play for no one but himself. Witnesses described this music as mystical sacred melodies that were sometimes unbearably sad, sometimes explosively joyful, and always beyond human comprehension. In these moments, Tom was not blind. Tom, the curiosity. He was Thomas Green Wiggins, a man mourning the mother he lost and dreaming of a freedom he would never touch. This music was his refuge, his rebellion, and ultimately, his revenge. It was the only part of his existence that belonged entirely to him. In the end, the Bethunes are remembered only as the shadows in Tom's story. Their money is gone, and their power has dissolved into the dust of history. But Tom's music survives, studied by scholars and performed by pianists who marvel at his genius. His life proves a painful yet profound truth. Talent can be imprisoned and justice can be delayed, but the human spirit is more than what is done to it. Tom was called property, but he was a person. He was called an idiot, but he was a genius. He never got his revenge through a courtroom or a confrontation. He got it through the revenge of endurance. He left behind something beautiful that his enemies could neither create nor destroy. He proved that, even inside a body treated as property, there was something irreducibly, powerfully human. James Bethune is dust. John Bethune is dust. Eliza Bethune is dust. Their grand legal maneuverings, their calculated greed, and their careful exploitation of a human soul have all crumbled into the forgotten corners of history. But somewhere, at this very moment, someone is sitting at a piano playing one of Tom A.C. compositions. Somewhere, a listener is hearing those haunting melodies for the first time and feeling a stir in their soul that they cannot explain. This is the ultimate revenge of Thomas Wiggins. It is not the violent or dramatic ending favored by Hollywood. It is something more lasting and far more true. The boy who never spoke a single word to the world said everything that mattered through his music, and a century later, we are still listening. In recent years, there has been a slow, painful reckoning with the injustice of Tom's life. Musicologists now analyze the intricate structures of his work, and historians have unearthed the documents that prove his guardianship was merely slavery by another name. There are calls for his induction into halls of fame and demands for reparations from the wealth he generated for his captors. Yet, these efforts, however necessary, raise a devastating question. Can any memorial, any plaque, or any sum of money compensate for 50 years of stolen freedom? The answer is a hollow no. The injustice of Tom's existence is complete and irreversible. We cannot give him back the life he should have had, but we can finally see his story as a warning, a testament to what happens when human beings are treated as property and their humanity is denied for profit. The life of Thomas Wiggins was shaped by forces he could neither influence nor escape. Born into chains, sold as a curiosity, and kept as a legal ward, his fate was decided by the signatures of men who viewed him as an asset rather than a person. And yet, within that cage, he found a way to be entirely himself. This is the great paradox of his life. He was utterly powerless, yet his music commanded the attention of the world's most powerful people. He was silenced, yet he spoke with a voice that transcended borders and time. If Tom could speak to us today, we don't know if he would be angry, or sad, or proud. His private thoughts remained locked in the mind the world called defective. But in his music, if you listen closely, you can hear a voice crying out from the darkness, demanding to be recognized, insisting on its own value. Ultimately, Thomas Wiggins gave the world more than just music. He gave it proof. He proved that genius has no color, and that the human spirit cannot be crushed by laws or cruelty. His oppressors tried to use him as evidence of black inferiority, parading him as a freak who only succeeded because of white management. But their lives collapsed every time his fingers touched the keys. If black people were truly inferior, how could this blind, idiotic child outperform the best white musicians in the world? Every note he played was a silent argument against the ideology of white supremacy. He didn't need to protest or fight. His art was the most powerful refutation of their world. He proved them wrong simply by existing, paying for that truth with a lifetime of suffering. This is the legacy of Thomas Green Wiggins. Not just the surviving compositions, but the irrefutable fact of his genius. He sacrificed his freedom, his earnings, and his very identity so that this truth could be demonstrated. Through his music, he escaped the categories meant to contain him and defeated the ideology meant to define him as less than human. His was a revenge of beauty, a revenge of truth, and a revenge of endurance. The boy who never spoke a word had the last word after all. And that word, echoing across the centuries, was music. This was the life and legacy of Thomas Wiggins, a story of a man who was silenced by society but whose soul refused to remain quiet. His journey from an enslaved curiosity to a global musical icon is a testament to the fact that while bodies can be shackled and wealth can be stolen, true genius belongs to no one but the Creator. Tom was a man who lived in total physical darkness, yet he brought a unique light into the world through his melodies, a light that his oppressors tried to claim as their own, but failed. If you found this exploration into one of history's most tragic yet brilliant figures moving, please leave a comment below. Which part of Tom's journey touched you the most? Was it his silent rebellion or the heartbreaking loss of his mother? Your engagement helps us bring these buried stories back to life. Do not forget to subscribe to the Forgotten Liturgy and hit the bell icon so you never miss our deep dives into the shadows of history. Your support ensures that names like Thomas Green Wiggins are never forgotten again. Thank you for listening, and we will see you in the next story.